Matthew, let's start. The original screenplay by Arash Amal was, I think it was written not long after Marie Bremer's article came out in Vanity Fair. And I'm just curious about the moment of your involvement, because having watched your 2017 film City of Ghosts about the organization Raqqa is being slaughtered silently, there's so many parallels with the film that everyone's just watched. When did you become involved, and was working on that film sort of something that fed into this?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Yes. I'd actually just finished my 2015 documentary, Cartel, and I was sent an early draft of the script. And it just spoke to me in a really profound way. My mom is a journalist. You know, my background obviously is in documentary and journalism, and so it just felt like a film that I had to make. I felt a huge connection to Marie in many ways, and I think in my documentary work I've tried to, you know, put a human face to conflicts around the world. And I think, like her, I've carried a lot of what I've witnessed and what I've seen back with me home, and so yeah, I just had a huge amount of empathy, and although I never knew her personally, I guess I just felt quite close to her, and I felt like this was a story that I had to make. And I think, obviously, given the world that we're living in now, with journalists and journalism under attack, I thought it was quite important to tell a story about people out there fighting for the truth, and shedding light on dark corners of the world.
You mentioned your 2015 film Cartel, and to watch that film and also City of Ghosts in light of the film that you've just made, the other thing I find very, very interesting as a parallel between you and Marie is that there's this focus, a shift away from the idea of presenting a geopolitical grand narrative of the world and saying if you don't focus on the people on the ground, then you're just going to get your head caught up in the clouds and perhaps lose sight of what the real story is.
Yeah, I mean, in my documentaries, I often get criticized for not giving context or not giving, talking heads or professors or other things like that. You know, certain filmmakers do that, certain films do that. For me, it's all about, human beings. It's all about humanizing a situation. It's all about trying to create a sense of empathy with a story that might feel, distant and far away, and trying to get people to care and think and ponder about it. So that's obviously what Marie did for a way longer period of time and, way more dangerous places, for her entire career. But in my short little career, that's what I've tried to do as well.
Paul, obviously the nature of fictional filmmaking, even when you're capturing a real life, there's a lot of compression that goes on. And I was wondering if you could talk about your first encounter with Marie and her looking for a boatman.
Yes, yeah, it wasn't quite as short as that in the film. In 2003, before the last Iraq war, there was a kind of, we wanted to get into Iraq before the invasion started. So we'd gone up to a little tiny place in northeastern Syria called Kamishli, and it was about 40 of us all in one really horrible hotel called a Petroleum Hotel. And every day we'd all get up, walk down to this secret police office, and we'd walk in, they'd give us a cup of tea, and we'd go, any permission? And they'd go, no. And we'd all walk back up the hotel and just sit there. After about a month, I got completely fed up with this and bored. So I got my driver to go and buy me 4 big lorry inner tubes and a string of rope, and I built a boat in my hotel room, which is kind of weird, because I was sat in my hotel room and I could see out the window and it was the desert, and I'd look back in my room and there'd be my boat taking shape. So I built it in the end, talked a few people into coming with me. More fool they. But I rolled the boat up, loaded out into a rope, and we went to the Tigris River. And it was about midnight, and we were pumping the tyres up to cross into Iraq. And an army patrol came across us, ambushed us, captured us, kept us prisoner for a bit. And then he let us out. And no one else had talked to me. All the other journalists, like, you've spoilt our war. So I was kind of sitting in the corner of the bar on my own. And Marie walked in and was kind of silhouetted by the backlight, and she just walked in, she went, who and where is the boatman? And I was like, And she just come across and she goes, "Boatman, I like your style. Can I buy you a drink?" And I was like, "Yes, please." And yeah, we bonded over that. And I think that was the basis, you know, when our relationship starts like that, you know, only good things can happen.
So, jumping forward a number of years to Libya, what do you think it was about the combination of the two of you that proved effective? Because obviously people have spoken, including Marie's editor, about the number of photographers that she didn't get on with.
Yeah. I do think partially that beginning, you know, meeting like that. But really, you know, I've been covering war for a while, and we both had the shared view of what you spoke earlier, what Matt's doing. You know, we like to get in, and you know, war is such a big subject, and the geopolitics, the military aspects. We just found the most effective way of portraying war was to go into where the people who have the least voice, who have the least options are. And they are generally, you know, the women and children who are stuck in basements, who can't run, who have no voice to the outside world when these conflicts are occurring. And we both saw it like that. So when we went out on assignment, it was really quite easy working with Marie because I knew she knew what she was doing. She never turned around and said to me, "Did you get that shot?" As I never had to turn around and say, you know, did you get this aspect of the story? And when we sat down and we put the story together and we put the pictures in, it just seemed to work. And the paper used to ring me up, you know, when we first started the debate. "You okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they go, "You still with her?" And I'm going, "Yeah." And they're like, "Okay." Put the phone down. A few days later, "You still with her?" And in the end, they just stopped ringing. They thought, right, leave it. If it works, leave it.
Talking about the compression of time, Matthew, something I think works particularly well in this film is the use of sort of ellipses that she will walk through from one room through a door into another room in a completely different location. Not just in the compression of time, but also trying to draw out the psychological impact of conflict on her. Could you talk a little bit about developing those ideas?
Sure, yeah. You know, I really did not want to make a traditional biopic. You know, for me, the film is more of a psychological thriller, trying to understand sort of what drives somebody to go to these places and the effects that had on her. And those really harsh transitions between war and home and war and home and war and home were just such a natural way to convey the trauma of what she was experiencing. And for me, you know, the film is an examination of many things, but it's an examination of, you know, her PTSD and the, you know, and so those transitions were an opportunity to not just move between time, but to get inside of her head and to, you know, PTSD is not, I mean, for everyone it's different, but for many people it's sort of these hyper-real images that one can't shake, that you can't forget or get out of your head. And she had many of these images, you know, accumulated over time. Those sequences in the script were much more sort of linear. They're much more, much more linear. And in the edit room, we sort of developed this language that you just described, of really just sort of flashes of thoughts and sort of this melange of cacophonous images that were sort of bouncing between her head. And you know, that was something that Rosamund and I spent a lot of time talking about. We spent months and months and months talking about and preparing to shoot those scenes, which, you know, were quite difficult, to be honest. In some ways more difficult than, you know, the big like action sequences. You know, personifying PTSD is not something I'd necessarily seen too often in film, and I really wanted to try to at least get it moderately right. And so, you know, we read a lot of, obviously, what Marie wrote about her own PTSD, and I talked about my own experiences, and Paul talked about his experiences, and so, you know, the scene, for example, after the mass grave, in the script it said, Marie types up an article. But for me, it was this amazing opportunity to sort of try to take stock of what she had just witnessed. And so I really wanted that sort of low angle, almost voyeuristic, we shouldn't be in this room with her, we shouldn't be inside of her head angle that allowed us to sort of, get inside of what she was experiencing as she wrote these articles. And from Rosamund's perspective, I said to her, look, we're gonna get rid of the whole crew, just gonna be you, me, Bob Richardson, our DP, sound, maybe makeup, and it was just this very small splinter crew, and I just let the camera roll and let her move around that room. I said, you can move it in and out of frame, and those are basically like 2 14-minute takes, and then the sort of the bookend of that scene when she arrives back in London, same thing. So sorry, that was a long answer.
No. It just highlights the fact it's an extraordinary performance by Rosamund Pike. Now, if I'm right, you both wrote an essay about Marie Colvin before you started, or as you were beginning to work together?
So when I was looking for someone to play Marie, I had actually met Rosamund at a screening of my last documentary, City of Ghosts. We got along quite well, and then we had breakfast the next morning, and just her profound understanding of this character at such an early stage, not even being attached to the film, was, it was extraordinary. And after this breakfast, we both wrote each other sort of, who is Marie Colvin, these little, 3-page essays, and they were so similar, and I just knew that I had my Marie. And having never made a narrative film before, I really wanted somebody who was gonna, A, get their hands dirty, and B, treat me like an equal. And I got both of those in spades, and an amazing partner in Rosamund.
And Paul, with Jamie Dornan, where you sent a list of people and you went, Brad Pitt, too old, not good looking enough. Jamie Dornan will do. That's kind of fine for me.
Yeah, it's done me no harm.
Just tell them how introduced this.
What's the experience like, though, of obviously advising on a film, but actually having a part of your life projected onto the screen?
It was, when I knew the film was in development, and I kept hearing rumours. We were working on a documentary at the same time. My first involvement was when Matt gave me a call and said he'd just read the book, and I'd just seen Cartel, and City of Ghosts was coming out. Were they going to have a meet with them at the Frontline Club in London to do a Q&A? And we did the Q&A, and then we sat down. Ros was with us, and Matt explained he'd been brought on board to do the feature Private War, which immediately put aside. The fears were, this was Marie, a good friend. Her family was her legacy. That many people will come to Marie through this and remember her through this. So there was a degree of caution, but I think an hour later or 4 hours later we walked out the bar, and I was convinced Matt, what a pedigree for someone to take on someone as she is quite challenging, and Ros, within half an hour with Ros, I could feel that she really was going to do it justice, and that continued through the film. Confidence grew and grew and grew. I showed up on the set, and I think people on the set at the time were naturally a bit wary about, especially Jamie, the poor lad. Marie wasn't there. Ros did everything she could. Jamie had me stood there going, "Go on then." So we met at the airport, and he I was like, "Oh yeah," and I just, oh shit, I need fags. So I thrust me bag into his hands and ran off to duty free, and came back with 400 Marlboro. And anyone who's read the book or seen the film will know that cigarettes played a large part in our lives. And he just stood there and went, "Wow, just like the book." And so then, but Jamie's such a lovely guy, and I think Matt even said, when he met Jamie after meeting me, that we were very similar anyway. Well, from there up, we were really very similar. So it didn't take, yeah. it didn't take much for us to bond, and we had a few beers early on, and after that, I think there was one part where Jamie was a bit, his first scene where he was being me, he kind of really nicely said, do you want to not stand there while I do the first scene? And I got that, but I think after the first morning, all of them fears melted away, and hopefully, I think both Ros and Jamie would come up before most scenes and say, okay, look, we've got the words, we know what's happening in the scene, but what were you thinking at this point in time? And I would tell them what was going through our heads, and I think they went back to the scene, and I think it was quite helpful to have that background. So it wasn't just the words in the script, it was our emotional state was given to them as well.
Yeah. Let's get some questions from the audience. We've got some time. There's a hand up there, and is there someone over this side?
Thank you so much. I wanted to not sort of escape my documentary roots, but embrace them in making this film. I guess in some weird way, in my documentaries, I tried to make them feel like narrative films. In my first narrative film, I tried to make it feel like a documentary. When I was 21 years old, I heard Al Maisels speak, and he said, if you end up with the story you started with, then you're not listening along the way, which I think is good advice for life. And I think it's good advice for filmmaking. It's, be open to the story changing, be open to the sort of wonderful, happy accidents of life. And that's something that I've held very near and dear to my heart at every step along the way in my career. And I really wanted to try to bring that ethos into this process as possible. And that's honestly something that I feared, is could I do that? So many of the scenes, I tried to create an environment that felt as real and authentic as possible. I tried to create an environment where improvisation could happen. The scene for example, at the mass grave, another thing I did was work with predominantly non-actors in all the war zones. So we shot all the war zones in Jordan, London for London, and Jordan was Sri Lanka, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. And spent weeks and weeks and weeks casting all of the background extras from refugees that we found from all those various countries, so that when we're in Iraq, those are real Iraqi refugees. When we're in Syria, those are real Syrian refugees. But going back to the scene in the mass grave, when we started that day, it was just a blank, desert field, and the digger rolls up, and it was chaotic, and the sounds were as chaotic as it seems in the film. My sound man wanted to kill me, the Rosamund was basically just walking around and interviewing people, and it just my hair was on end. It felt like I was shooting a verite documentary scene. And at the end of that day, as the sun was setting, it was so emotional, and these women who were crying started doing this, just pounding their chests and doing this prayer for the dead. And that's not something that was scripted. That's not something that was planned. But it was this sort of beautiful crescendo to the scene. In Syria and Homs, the women that she interviews in the widow's basement, those are real women, really from Homs, who are actually really in a shelter for women and children during the siege. And so when Rosamund walks in, I said, those are two people that you can talk to. You can talk to really whomever you want. And we really shot that, docu style. And they were telling their own real stories, shedding real tears. And the second woman, none of this was scripted, what they were saying. The second woman, she says, I don't just want this to be words on paper. I want the whole world to understand what we're going through. There's a whole generation that's been lost. That's anger and passion that's coming out of her. She's not speaking to a Hollywood actress. She's speaking to all of us. The man in the hospital, and I'll shut up. The man in the hospital, his 2-year-old nephew was shot off his shoulders at a protest in Homs, and bled out and died in front of him. And so the trauma and the sort of gravitas that he brought onto set that day was almost unbearable. And at one point, Rosamund walked off set and said, I'm not sure I can handle this. The lines between documentary and fiction are so blurred. are we exploiting this man? And I said to her, look, this is something I deal with on a daily basis in my documentaries, is you have this human instinct to want to give someone a hug or to give them space, but your job, as my job, as Marie's job, as Paul's job, is and was to tell their story, to capture these moments. And he wouldn't be here if he didn't want his story to be told. And there's so many examples of that throughout the film. How long do you have?
We're staying for another 3 hours?
Briefly, it involved, I was trapped for another 5 days. I had a massive big hole that had gone through the back of my leg and a lot of shrapnel. So the doctors kind of scrubbed it out with a toothbrush, a bottle of iodine, and got an office staple gun and stapled my leg back on. They wrapped it in a bandage. We then were stuck for 5 days, and the government knew we were still alive, so they kind of focused their fire on the building we were in, which just fell down around us. But after 5 days, they came, and it was a last-ditch attempt. They just threw us lot into the back of a pickup, and 5 pickups set up, and we just drove straight through the front line. We drove through head-on through the Assad forces, who just kind of threw everything at us. I think they killed 23 of the people we set off with. And they got me to a tunnel, tied a rope around me. We got in through the tunnel, tied a rope around me, lowered me in, and there was this motorbike, cut-down motorbike that they put me on the back of, and drove me 3 kilometers underground through a storm drain. And from that point on, I was passed from people. I had to get out of the area of Homs, and then over the next three days, I think I drove on the back of a motorbike across the mountains into Lebanon. So yeah, it was pretty grueling. The best bit though was when I got out the tunnel and I crawled across this field. This guy picked me up and put me on a piggyback, and I thought, that's all right. But he put his hand through my leg, not realizing that what he'd done. It was pitch black, and we were creeping along. And so he's carrying me with his hand in my leg, and I'm kind of hitting him, going ah, and he thought I was saying faster, faster. And it was his mate kind of looked in the end and went, oh, actually, I think we have an issue here. And I was going, ah, and he's going. So then he put me and carried me through. So, no, it was a bit of a trip. It was.
I highly recommend you all see the amazing documentary that Paul made called Under the Wire, which examines that whole journey.
I was going to say as well, Paul's own book, also entitled Under the Wire. It's quite amazing how truncated that is from the actual story, which is quite extraordinary. Also, if you haven't seen Matthew's films Cartel Land and City of Ghosts, they're 2 extraordinary documentaries by a quite brilliant filmmaker. Thank you to Altitude and also to the BFI for organising this event. But most of all, can you please join me in thanking our guest tonight?